It's September 1939 and Hitler is about to invade Poland. He has a fearsome weapon that is key to his strategy, the tank. In this outing of the History Book Buffs, we're going to be talking about Mark Urban's fantastic new book, Tank, 10 War Machines That Changed History and the remarkable men behind them. We're also going to be looking at some other great books featuring tanks. And don't forget, give us a follow, drop us a like if you want more brilliant history books and not just ones about tanks. In the meantime, I'll hand you over to me talking to Roger Morehouse, and I'll be asking him at the end of the episode the crucial question, tank or U-boat, which would you rather serve on? So Roger, 1939, Hitler loves a tank. I mean, you love a tank, but Hitler really loves a tank.
Yeah.
And the Germans love tanks. Now, they are about to invade Europe. And the tank is absolutely central to that plan. And it's going to completely revolutionise warfare, how people perceive it, how they carry it out, how it happens. And it all centres around the tank. So
Absolutely.
talk us through that moment.
Yeah, so 1st of September 1939, Hitler's invasion of Poland, subject that we all know very well now, of course. And yeah, it is absolutely, tank based. It's the first, it's the debut of Blitzkrieg as a sort of military doctrine.
So
not completely.
Define it for us. So what's happening? He's rushing out of Germany. Not him himself. I mean, Hitler's not up there in a turret. Yeah. But, talk me through what it actually means. What does Blitzkrieg actually mean? Yeah,
so German forces invade, at dawn on the 1st of September. And the key to Blitzkrieg, and I have to state before we get lots of angry letters, it is, as a doctrine, it is incompletely applied in 1939. So there are some units that are doing it and doing it very effectively, and there's some units literally next door to them that are not yet. And the key to Blitzkrieg is that it's about combined arms, right? So using air support, using artillery, all rolled into one and cooperating with one another. But the key to it is speed. So you have these armoured spearheads that basically rush as fast as they can. They defeat whatever's in front of them and get quickly to the enemy's rear areas where they cause havoc. And they sort of go and, take a bridge, or they go and take a particular road crossing or whatever it is. And the whole intention is that you disrupt your enemy's ability to adequately defend. There's a great moment which comes up, I think it's in Guderian's memoir, which we'll talk about later on, where one of his commanders says, what's my target for the day? And he says, show me your map. And this guy shows him his map, and he sort of takes the map and he unfolds it. And he says, no, we don't want you here, we want you here, right? And it's like sort of, 40, 50 kilometres away. And the guy's going, like, really? And that's the essence of Blitzkrieg, is to absolutely go as hell for leather as fast as you can, combined arms, all of that, but with these fast armoured spearheads. And it completely, disrupts the enemy's ability to defend.
Because everybody knows this, but the idea before Hitler launched this Blitzkrieg was that, even if there was a war, it was going to be like World War I. It would be slow. It would be trenches. It would be like, the famous Blackadder line of how much ground have we captured today, sir? Well, this exact amount of ground. And this changed everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, we'll come back to talking about the book in a moment, but this was still the thinking at the end of the First World War, when you have the debut of the tank, was that the tanks moved essentially at the speed of infantry. They moved at about 4 or 5 miles an hour, walking pace, right? Which meant that, although revolutionary though they were not yet being used to their full potential. And what you see with Blitzkrieg as a doctrine, which emerges first of all in 39, it's perfected to a large extent by 1940, the French campaign. It really is used to its greatest extent and greatest effect in Operation Barbarossa against the Soviets in 41. What you see is the tank being used for its speed, for its sort of punching power, and essentially it's not tanks moving at the speed of infantry. It's infantry having to move at the speed of the tank. That's the difference.
So we're talking today about a new book about tanks by Mark Urban. Now, I was a little nervous about doing this book. I mean, we should say for our audience that before you became a historian, you were actually a mechanic.
Yes.
So you love this
I
stuff.
love this stuff. I've got a sort of technological, streak, technological bent. So I do get quite into the technological stuff, and he does a lot of that in the book, and I really enjoy it. I appreciate it might be a slightly gendered thing, but I find all that stuff quite fascinating.
Look, I mean, I can barely drive an automatic car, and I certainly do not give a monkey's how it works. But I actually really enjoyed this book. You did slightly force it upon me, and I actually found it fascinating. So what it does is it looks at the history of the tank and the impact of the tank on military warfare in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it does that by looking at a kind of in-depth history of 10 tanks.
Yep.
The people who conceived of them, the people who built them, and the people who operated them.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of human interest here as well. I hate to be stereotypically female, but I did need a little bit of human interest to to pull me through the
And there is enough of that. So he starts. So it is, like I say, it's 10 chapters. Each one is the story of a tank. So it's chronological. Starts with the British Mark IV from the First World War, ends with the US Abrams from 80s, 90s, and even used today. And each one starts with a sort of a set piece with lots of like you say, human material, lots of first-hand stuff, and talking about the impact of the tank, a particular moment which is kind of symbolic of that particular tank's impact, and then it goes back into how the particular tank developed, those that were responsible for it, the idea behind it, how it was a response to either previous tanks or to sort of battlefield conditions or countermeasures. One of the key trends throughout the book actually is the development of countermeasures, which is really interesting. How that then in turn influences the next generation of tanks. Things like the hollow charge and so on, which I'm sure you know all about.
I do now.
That's really significant in terms of how it, you constantly have this pressure to up armor, to put more armor onto the tank, which of course increases the weight, which means it's less maneuverable, which means, you get to something like the Tiger tanks, which weighed 60 tons near enough.
60 tons. I can't even envisage that.
Yeah, this is astonishing, like absolutely astonishing. The average family car is between 1 and 1.5 tons. So
okay, that's heavy.
Yeah.
Okay, 60 tons.
So 60 tons.
Yeah.
And the Germans themselves had the problem with the Tiger, which was a brilliant tank by all accounts, but it was way too heavy. So that put strains on the engines, put strains on the gearboxes. It meant that when they were actually in combat, they had to be ferried to the combat area on tanks, on trains, on flatbed trains. And once they're there, they can't go across bridges because they'll make the bridges collapse. Right, so it's a real problem, and there's a line in the book where he talks about the Germans in the Normandy campaign in '44.
Yeah,
there were like 15 of these Tigers that were left on the western side of the Seine because they couldn't retreat over the Seine, so they just destroyed them and went on foot.
Let's row back the first tanks. Tell us about the first tank.
Yeah, I mean, really interesting. All of this grows out of the stalemate and the stasis on in the Western Front. All of the sort of the innovation of the First World War. You think of the use of gas, the use of tunneling under the enemy's trenches. Even air power really had its debut before the First World War, but really comes into its own in the First World War. So all of these are ways of getting around the stasis of the First World War, the trench warfare. And the tank is considered, it's first mooted in 1915, I think. You got the first examples in 1916, really sees its first action. As he says, the British Mark IV is the one that's the sort of great success of the First World War, which sees its first action the end of 1917 and then in 1918 as well, is actually quite a huge thing. It has a crew of 8. It has a massive, Daimler engine inside it, which, in which everyone else has to work around it. It has the sort of machine guns on the outside of it. It's a big rhomboid-shaped thing, and it's huge. And it travels, as I say, it travels about 4 or 5 miles an hour. Interestingly, more tank crews died of carbon monoxide poisoning than of combat.
Really?
In the First World War, which tells you a lot about how hideous it was. But the first moments where they sort of lumber into action, and the Germans don't know what to do about it, and they're terrified, and they don't have effective countermeasures. So they just, you can fire your rifle at it, it won't do any good. The only thing that does much is sort of artillery fire. But again, that you have to organise that.
And it's moving. Albeit slowly.
Yeah. So it has that tremendous shock effect. A little bit like you saw in 1939, like I just mentioned. You have to sort of think about how you're going to deal with it. But those initial breakthroughs in the First World War are not really exploited effectively. So that the infantry don't really sort of follow behind. They can't exploit the breakthroughs effectively enough. They do to some extent in 1918, but still, they have to think through how to use this weapon much more effectively. Mm-hmm. And that becomes one of the great discussions of the interwar years. Is, do you have different types of tank for different purposes? Can you build a sort of universal tank that would do everything? And how do you fit it into your existing sort of military doctrine? Which is the question that the Germans answer most effectively with Blitzkrieg, as we see in 1939.
But so he makes the point very clearly, doesn't he, that the history of the tank is not a linear progression. There are lots of dead ends.
Yeah. Which I found fascinating, because I think, even with, I would say, a pretty good knowledge of, of this stuff, I imagined that the sort of the trajectory of the tank is more linear than it actually is. And he talks about, these sort of, what in British nomenclature were known as sort of cruiser tanks, these sort of fast moving, lightly armoured, sort of punch through tanks, rather than main battle tank, like as in a heavy tank that would resist everything and moved slowly. So there are different ideas being put about in the interwar years.
Those strike me as ideas that have their roots in cavalry, right? Because you have your kind of heavy armoured cavalry and your light cavalry, and those are different things.
Exactly, and it's no surprise that cavalry, once with the end of the horse, which does last into the Second World War, as we know, with Battle for Poland was still essentially a horse-drawn and horse-borne fight in many ways, on both sides. Avoiding the myth about the Poles being on horseback against German tanks. Let's not go there. But it is still on both sides, a huge amount of horses. But it's no surprise that, cavalry regiments, for example, are the ones that are first sort of sent into tanks and put into tanks. So many, and often they still have the name cavalry.
It must feel a little bit like, especially those early ones, the big rhomboid ones trundling across the trenches. It must feel like you're inside your own coffin before you're even dead.
Yeah. And the countermeasures thing again is another one of these. I think where we assume that trajectory is linear. The countermeasures is one of those things that, like, literally and metaphorically sort of affects that trajectory from the outside. So in the early years, it's just it's essentially artillery fire. How can you get a shell that will penetrate that steel hull? And they do very effectively. And then you get the hollow charge, which evolves in the Second World War.
I think you need to explain the hollow charge.
Hollow charge is an artillery piece or an artillery shell, which at the moment of impact, whereas before, an artillery, if you think of a bullet, it's just a solid piece of metal, right? Yeah. And it's fired out from the cartridge, and the bullet travels, and it's just kinetic. It's purely kinetic. Yeah. So it's just about how the bullet penetrates whatever it penetrates, or sometimes it doesn't at all because it can't get through. A hollow charge is a bullet which has a sort of a hollow centre, and it has a copper cone inside it, and various metals that, on impact, it effectively creates a sort of a physical reaction in the metals that means that it embeds itself, and it kind of burns through the metal rather than just being purely kinetic. It's physics, right? So then it becomes this thing that effectively, like a welding torch, it effectively welds its way through the metal, right? So this is this changes the game completely, because essentially, it was all about just putting enough metal in the way that your standard bullet or artillery piece couldn't penetrate the metal. But suddenly with a hollow charge, it will.
So you have to react. This is what
So you have to react.
Yeah.
So then you've got, the development of, they try and put, more metal in the way. Again, to some extent it works, some extent it doesn't. And then much later on, you jump forward to 1970s, 1980s, you've got reactive armour, which not only stops the hollow charge, but actually interrupts that process, that chemical physical process of the weld through the metal. So really, it's really clever stuff, and he tells it beautifully. He tells it really, really well.
So let's just jump back to before World War II then. So it's the Germans who have this kind of idea that actually we might have been doing this wrong. Talk me through the development of this into a whole new ballgame.
Yeah, but there were a lot of thinkers on this from the end of the First World War onwards. Like, there are various schools of thought as to how tanks should develop. There are those that say they should just be sort of infantry support, i.e. travelling at the same speed as infantry. And then there are others who are saying, this is potentially a game-changing weapon. We have to use it to its best effect. And people like that, there was a chap called JFC Fuller, so British, who was one of the great advocates of the tank, early advocates of the tank. And he sort of fed his ideas into, as one example was Heinz Guderian, later the German general, who became the great advocate of the tank in German circles. And he says in his memoir, Guderian, that he took the ideas of people like Fuller, and Fuller never really got much traction in British circles, because that was one of many voices that, in different pathways that the tank might have gone. But his ideas on this and his writings found a really fertile ground in Guderian, and Guderian then sort of runs with this, and of course that meshes with Germany's ideas of having a quick war. You had to have a quick war because they didn't have the economic resources to prosecute a long war, so it had to be quick. It meant you had to knock out your enemy very quickly. All of this fitted together in terms of doctrine, worked very well with the politics and the economics. And of course, the German military saw itself as being sort of revolutionary, saw itself as being it had to adopt, novel solutions to problems, because it didn't have much in the way of resources, it didn't have much in the way of time, as it saw itself. So all of this found a very, very fertile ground in someone like Guderian, and he says this in so many words in his memoir. We had to learn for the support and for the infantry to run at the same time same speed as the tank, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And that's really the birth of, that's the Blitzkrieg idea right there. In that one sentence, that's Blitzkrieg.
I was fascinated as well about the echoes of Blitzkrieg, because ever since it worked so brilliantly, it has informed all the strategic thinking that's followed, right? Everybody wants, we've just seen it in the Ukraine war. Both Putin and Zelensky have kind of fallen into the trap that, if we can get there quickly, then, the prize is over. Yeah, the prize is ours.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the idea that the Blitzkrieg is possible has created a kind of, military trap, hasn't it, in a way?
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's interesting because again, even within World War II and within the Blitzkrieg, there are then differing pathways. So the Germans go for ever bigger tanks, of course, but also very specialised. So they had various versions of the same tank, and then then you've got the Panzer Mark V and the Panzer VI, which is the Tiger. So you've got all of these factories who are all doing different things and producing different variants, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that can work, and it did work for a long time. And you contrast that with what the Soviets do, which is basically build T-34s, which is the next tank that he talks about in the book. And they build T-34s in pretty much every factory they had. So where take something like the German Panther tank, which is the Panzer Mark V. The Germans produce about 6,000 of those across the whole war, okay, which is quite a decent figure. The Soviets are producing 6,000 T-34s a month, right? So that's another aspect of the whole narrative around tanks. Who's going to win? Do you specialise and produce really specialist tanks, or do you just mass produce something that works pretty well? And that was the Soviet road they went down, and it worked very well. So they had a massive tank force. They used the tank essentially like a throwaway weapon because there's always another one. Germans couldn't do that because they didn't have the numbers. So there's all these different pathways. But anyway, so yeah, you're right. So Blitzkrieg works really, really well in the opening years of the war. And then, of course, the Soviets start using it essentially against the Germans. So they learn pretty quickly and start using it back against the Germans. And then you've got, a much more mobile war, but Blitzkrieg itself doesn't work anymore. So from then on, effectively, I think everybody is slightly starry-eyed about those moments early in the war, the first half of the war, when Blitzkrieg, German tanks were sort of, destroying everything in front of them. And it's a bit like, if you cast your mind back to the bombing of Hamburg, 1943, which is it's kind of an accident of, the weather, the right units on the right night, the targeting was right, all came together. The target was, very flammable. Central Hamburg was all made of wood. So all of this it all came together in Hamburg, and you got this massive conflagration, tens of thousands of people killed, right? And all of the Allied planners kind of go, wow, right, let's do it again. And then they spend the rest of the war essentially trying to do it again, and they're never able to do it. And I think there's a similar story with tanks and Blitzkrieg, because that first half of the war, the Germans cast everyone before them, and they're brilliant. That tactic, that's doctrine, works brilliantly well for them for the first half of the war. And it's like, from then on, everybody else is trying to do the same thing, but in a sense, everybody knows the game by then, and everyone has the countermeasures to counter it. So it never works in quite the same way ever again. And this is why I think you get to the end of Mark Urban's story with the development of the tank, where, by the early 21st century rather, before the Ukraine war, a lot of people have essentially stopped making tanks. A lot of countries, particularly smaller countries, have given up their tank stock, saying, well, we don't need tanks anymore. The war of the future is going to be asymmetric. It's going to be, insurgencies, like Iraq or Afghanistan was. So that's the future. We don't need sort of heavy machinery that costs a lot of money and has to be maintained and all of that. So that looked like the end of the tank. And interestingly, he, as he says, and I'm sure that the Ukraine war was the impetus for the book, that war kind of put the tank once again front centre, interestingly. And again, not only highlighted its potential benefits militarily, but also its weaknesses.
And what about the future of the tank?
Future of the tank? It still has a role, I think, and he says the same thing. It still has a role. It's not entirely clear. It works well in where in the right conditions, but you can still destroy a £50 million tank with a £500 drone, as we're seeing in Ukraine. So that's a difficulty that a circle that's yet to be squared. But he says, and I think probably rightly, the way we're going is probably to have automation. And at some point we'll have robot tanks.
I don't want robot tanks. I don't want robot anything.
It's coming.
Although, to be fair, I mean, at least if you had a Russian robot tank coming at you, they're not going to leap out and start kidnapping your children and raping you.
That's true. Well, we hope.
Unless Putin has a special robot tank units. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Past him. Well, that's, lovely. It is a wonderful book, though.
It's very well done. Really, it's very well done and very readable, and it has lots of human stuff, and it really tells its story very well, I think. Yeah.
So listen, Roger, I'm going to ask you a question. You have just finished writing your book on being a German U-boat person. Submariner is the word I was looking for. If you had to choose, would you rather be in a submarine, in a wolf pack, being depth charged by the Allies?
Yeah.
Or would you rather be in a German tank advancing on Stalingrad? Can I also just point out, in this thought experiment, you're a conscript, not a Nazi.
Yeah. So I'm morally clean. That's what you're saying.
Clean.
Okay.
But like, which is more terrifying?
It's funny enough. There is an account that I had towards the end of my book, the U-boat book, from a former German pilot who found himself in a U-boat in the Atlantic right at the end of the war, being depth charged, and he has this sudden moment of realization where he says, "Okay, we're 1,000 miles from land. Beneath us is 2 kilometers of sea. And we're being depth charged." And he said, if everything goes wrong and you're in a plane, at least you've got a chance of getting down. Yeah. Right? If everything goes wrong here, there's only one direction we're going, and it's not a good one. Yeah. So on that basis, it's what my mum used to call a bugger's muddle. Because there's not much between them. It's a nasty choice. But on that basis, I would probably go with being in a tank.
Okay. All right. Well, controversial. I'd go with, pacifism.
Well, obviously, yeah.
Right. Books. Other books.
Yes.
So we've chosen a couple each.
I have. I mentioned Guderian's memoir. So Heinz Guderian, was the great German visionary, you could say, of tank warfare. And his memoir, Panzer Commander, which is, probably dates back to the 50s now in its English translation. But it's really good in terms of, charting that development of the tank and the struggles he had in the early years, the ideas he had. Of course, he always puts himself front and centre. That's what he does. But also in terms of, the warfare, he talks about the Polish campaign, French campaign, everything else. So it's a really good summary, and it's very well written as well, to be fair. So that's one that is hard not to recommend in this scenario.
Okay, and your second one, you love an eyewitness. I do
love an eyewitness, and my second one is Blood, Dust and Snow.
Great title.
It is a very good title, and so if you imagine Guderian he is in the tanks, he is at the front, certainly at the beginning of the war and later on, but his is not really a sort of maybe a periscope view, you could say. It's not the view from the tank itself so much, but this is. So Blood, Dust and Snow, Friedrich Sander. It's from a diary that was discovered not long ago, and it covers 1941 to 43, and he is a tank commander on the Eastern Front. And it is absolutely astonishing. I wrote the introduction to this book. It came out a couple of years ago. And I did the introduction to it. I think it's a real contribution to our understanding, and he talks about that sort of euphoria of victory in the early days, and then also the sort of the shortcomings of being attacked, the horror of being in a tank and under attack, and then how it all begins to fall apart in 43. Really, really interesting account. Blood, Dust
amazing.
And Snow.
Yeah, brilliant.
What about you?
Well, I've got two books. The first is a really interesting novel by Adrian Goldsworthy called Hill 112, and it's set in D-Day. Mm-hmm. And it follows the fortunes of 3 schoolboys from Wales, and one of them is a tank commander. And this book is really interesting because it blends fact and fiction. So it's like an hour-by-hour, day-by-day account of D-Day. And the tank sections are actually really brilliantly done, because what he does is he footnotes, within the fiction, he footnotes all the kind of acronyms and all the jargon, so that the guys in the tank can throw these terms around at each other that I would repeat, but obviously I can't remember any of them.
So you don't have to refer to an appendix or something. Yeah.
And so that he can put it in the text to give that text the kind of veracity. Yeah. And it's incredibly immersive. It works brilliantly. And it really does what military fiction ought to do. It gives you the answer to that question: what would it feel like to be there? So strong recommend. I reviewed that one in the Times and I gave it lots of love. Mm-hmm. So that's a really good one. The second book I'd like to recommend, slightly sucking up to you, Roger, is your book First to Fight, because I know, but it is a brilliant book. And it is about the German attack on Poland in 1939, and it's absolutely brilliant.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's crucially kind of mainly from the other side, I suppose. It's those on the receiving end of Blitzkrieg and how they react to it. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's a wonderful book and highly recommend it.
Oh, bless you. Thank you very much. Now, but that sort of first-hand stuff is really important, and that's where Blood, Dust, and Snow comes in as well.
Yeah.
To actually have that first-hand, as I said, the sort of periscope view of tank warfare is kind of terrifying. And there's not that much of it. I mean, Mark Urban uses quite a lot. Each of his chapters has, an opening section where he kind of puts you in the tank and, there was this engagement and
Yes.
puts you there, which is really evocative. It gives you that human element, but it's not that much of that material. So it's nice to be able to put it out there, whether it, as you say, whether it's non-fiction or fiction.
Yeah.
It's great to have someone that can put you there.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So great book, thumbs up.
Absolutely.
I think we just need to remind everybody that if they want more brilliant book reviews, they have to like and subscribe and follow and do all the social media things.
All those things.
All those things.
Yeah. So do all those things.
All those things. And we'll meet again next time.
See you next time.